Hello, everyone out there in Buzzkill Land. It is the famous professor here, busting myths, taking names. And we don't like on the show to talk about the most important this or the most important person or Churchill winning World War II all by himself or the Battle of Britain all by himself. But some events in history are so big that they really do get close to that description. And one of them is the Battle of Stalingrad. And fortunately for you, we have Professor Philip Nash on the line to tell us about this in what we will have as a two-part episode because this is such a big topic. Professor, thanks so much for coming back.
Always a pleasure. And yes, this is a topic that cannot be contained to just one part.
It cannot be contained to one part, and I think actually it's kind of forgotten. Now, let me tell you a little story about my and Lady Buzzkill's fabulous social life. Every time we go down to the yacht club, she abandons me and goes off with her gal pals, and I'm stuck there like Johnny No Friends. But the other day, somebody came up to me and started talking about the Battle of Stalingrad. It turns out he's a retired person, and he wants to write up a history of it as his sort of retirement passion project, as they say now. And he said, "What do you think?" And I said, well, my flip off the cuff answer in between martinis was most important battle of the war. Now, I just broke my rule there by saying most important battle, but it is so big and so epic that was my knee-jerk reaction.
It certainly is. No question about it. I mean, obviously, I like you, I sometimes hesitate when it comes to superlatives, but depending upon how you measure, if you take the Stalingrad campaign as a single battle, it is the largest, costliest single battle of World War II, largest, costliest urban battle in all of history. And often it's tagged as like, quote unquote, and this is sort of what you were alluding to, tagged as the quote unquote turning point of World War II. I'm going to argue that it's part of a larger turning point of World War II. Something like World War II is probably not going to have one single turning point anyway, right?
Yeah,
it's got two theaters of war, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll put it in context later at the end. But it's certainly part of a major turning point in the war. The fortunes of the Axis had essentially been on the rise, and afterwards they are not. And Stalingrad is a huge part of that explanation.
Well, we need to explain the situation that led up to the Battle of Stalingrad. By the way, let's remind Buzzkillers, we hate to have to say this. We have to give you homework, but there is no Stalingrad anymore. It's called something else.
Correct. Yes, it's now called, in fact, it wasn't called Stalingrad originally. It existed before Stalin. It was called Tsaritsyn. And afterwards, after World War II, after Stalin's death, as part of the de-Stalinization, they renamed it what it is today, which is Volgograd.
Right, but during the war under Stalin, it was named Stalingrad.
That's right. It was called Stalingrad, absolutely.
What was this situation that led up to the battle? And let's remind Buzzkillers where it is geographically in Russia.
Yeah. I'll talk about geography several times here, and if they're not familiar with the geography of southern Russia, the southern Soviet Union, Ukraine, they might want to get a map. I'm going to try my best to explain it, but having a map in front of you, ideally a map of Operation Blue, which I'll talk about, would certainly help. Basically, the Battle of Stalingrad happens because Hitler is trying to finish off the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. The Nazis, talked about this in other shows, Operation Barbarossa, June of 1941, the Germans invade the Soviet Union. I argued before, it's a pretty obvious point, I think, that it's the single worst mistake Hitler makes. Invading the Soviet Union is the single worst decision he makes. There's no question about it. In 1941, the operation had gone very, very well, advanced deep into the Soviet Union, destroyed massive Soviet forces, but it did not take the cities of Leningrad or Moscow, the capital, and did not deliver a knockout blow. The Soviet Union survived that initial onslaught despite a series of horrible defeats. And then Soviet counteroffensives in the winter of 1941-42 pushed the Germans back, particularly back from Moscow. So Hitler in early 1942, he's got a decision time. What is he going to do? And of course, he's going to try and finish the job. He's going to try to knock the Soviet Union out, especially now that the United States is in the war. And, in some ways, Hitler's not stupid. He realizes that now the deck is sort of stacked against him. So he wanted to have a short war before. Now he really wants a short war, right? A long war he figures he's going to lose. So he needs to end this war in the East. And so he decides on a campaign in the South. But here I have to talk a little bit about geography. If you have a map in front of you, it's great. But if you know your geography of the southern Soviet Union and southeastern Ukraine. That's where the line was in the spring of 1942. Basically, in the far eastern part of Ukraine, bordering on southern Russia. People are probably familiar with the Crimean Peninsula. To its northeast is the Sea of Azov, A-Z-O-V, which is off of the Black Sea. Basically, from the northeastern tip of the Sea of Azov straight north, more or less is where the line is, the front line. And so Hitler decides that he's going to have a more limited offensive than there was. But Barbarossa was all along the line, right? North, center, and south. Yeah. The entire Soviet Union was attacked from the west. This is a more limited offensive, which, among other things, also indicates the limits that the Germans are already facing. So they lost huge forces. They sustained huge losses in the initial phase of Operation Barbarossa. Losses that were very, very difficult to replace. Going into 1942, and this is going to be huge later in the campaign, the Germans are much more reliant on their allies.
Right.
In particular, the Romanians, the Hungarians, and the Italians. And that's going to play a huge role in what happens in the Battle of Stalingrad. But like I said, a long war Hitler figures as a disaster. Sitting back and marshaling your forces, right, building up, making your gains, or sort of consolidating your gains, making them more secure, fighting a defensive war, that doesn't strike him as an option at that point. Mm-hmm. And in retrospect, it is logical, because in 1942, the Soviet Union, despite their enormous setbacks of 1941, in 1942, they outproduced the Germans. All by themselves.
And by the way, Stalingrad is a major industrial center where all that production is going on. Yeah,
absolutely. In fact, it's not in my notes, but there's actually a point in the Battle of Stalingrad where factory workers who are producing T-34 tanks, they finish a tank and they drive it into battle themselves, fresh off the assembly line, which is pretty insane. Right, when the Germans are attacking your factory, sometimes that's what you have to do.
Well, it's sort of one of these stories. The Soviets, the average Soviet soldier just will not give up. They really are. Relentless.
And that's something the Germans were surprised by in 1941, like sort of the tenacity of the individual Soviet soldier, and they're going to find that out the hard way again in the Battle of Stalingrad. No question. In any case, so the Soviet Union was outproducing Germany in 1942 already, and so in a sense, going for broke for the Germans makes sense. Remember, Adolf Hitler's a gambler. His entire political career, his military career are based on gambles, so he's going to roll the dice again. And the Germans still have the initiative. I mean, they have sufficient combat power in the spring of 1942 to launch a major offensive. The problem for the Soviets is they expected the Germans to resume their assault on Moscow, much farther north. And that's one of the reasons why this campaign doesn't go well for them at first. The Soviets, as of May 1942, the bulk of their reserves are outside Moscow.
Yeah, so then, given all that situation and context, what does Hitler actually decide?
Yeah, he approves of what's called Operation Blue, or Fall Blau, as the Germans call it. So, and it's an assault on the southern part of the front only, toward the Caucasus Mountains. So once again, geography is key. In the very, very far south of Russia, today it's the former Soviet republics of Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, sort of bordering on Turkey and Iran, if my geography is correct, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Connecting those two bodies of water, running from northwest to southeast, are the Caucasus Mountains. It includes some of the highest mountains in all of Europe. Mm-hmm. This is an area where it's basically has 90% of the Soviet Union's oil reserves. 3 locations in particular, from west to east, Maikop, closer to the Black Sea, in the middle, Grozny, and then way down on the Caspian Sea, down in the southeast. The capital of Azerbaijan is Baku. Mm-hmm. Baku itself has 80% of Soviet oil
80%.
During World War II.
Wow.
80%. Maikop and Grozny have 10%. So all 3 locations, 90%. So Hitler's idea, and at this level it's not a bad one, is that if you can grab these oil resources, you deny them to the Soviet Union, and by the way, then they also become yours, right? It's a zero-sum game.
Yeah. Zero-sum game in a good way for Hitler, yeah.
Yeah, and the Germans are also... the Germans always have one eye on their own oil problem, which is almost all of their oil comes from Romania. So in other words, the Germans are heavily dependent on this one oil source. If you can grab this other, much larger oil source, then you might be in a better position to either win or to fight a longer war. So to get to the Caucasus, and as part of the way they round out Operation Blue, the Germans have to take into account the 2 major river features of this part of southern Russia. There are 2 rivers, the Don and the Volga. So the Don River, it basically starts south of Moscow, so much further north, flows southeast, About halfway down, it does a 90-degree turn back toward the southwest, where then it runs into the Sea of Azov near the city of Rostov-on-Don. And so it ends up in the Black Sea. It's a major river, but it's got this bend in it. Basically, it's like a wedge pointing east.
Mm-hmm.
At the point where it turns, there's this gap heading east of only about 50 miles. And after 50 miles further east is where you run into the Volga. So the Volga, people have probably heard of it. It's essentially the Mississippi River of Russia.
Yeah.
It's a huge river. It's a huge trading route going way, way back. It empties into the Caspian Sea. This point where the Don reaches farthest east, the Volga bends a bit and reaches furthest west. So there's sort of this north-south land bridge between the two rivers. At that point on the Volga, where it's farthest west, is the city of Stalingrad.
Again, another big, huge rivers powering eventually when the industrial are able to power these industrial centers and everything.
As in a lot of countries, major industrial centers are located on major rivers, right? It's not a coincidence. So Stalingrad, interesting city. It's almost entirely on, in fact, it is entirely on the west bank of the Volga.
Yeah.
And it's a long, skinny city. It's not very wide, but it runs north-south about 15 miles.
Mm-hmm.
It's major, you mentioned, it's a major industrial center. Heavy industry, production of military stuff, production of steel as well, I believe. And it's on this major artery for trade and commerce. And so what's interesting about Operation Blue is at this point in the planning stage and in the early stages, Stalingrad itself, the city, it's not a major goal of the campaign. It's secondary.
Oh, right.
The idea is that the German advance would start up north on the Don near the city of Voronezh and then head southeast and basically anchor your flank on Stalingrad. But the main goal is the Caucasus, much further south. And that's going to be one of the many major missteps of the Germans, is how basically their focus on Stalingrad comes to consume and basically blot out all their other objectives with no real purpose. But reaching Stalingrad was secondary. You didn't actually have to seize the city. Yeah, you wanted to anchor your left flank pointing south on the Volga and stop Volga River traffic. But the main goal of Operation Blue is the Caucasus and its oil and other mineral resources. So in retrospect, I'm already hinting at this, it's a stupid plan.
Yeah.
Among other things, it entails ridiculous overextension on the part of Axis forces. Baku is basically 700 miles away from the front line.
Wow.
Yeah, so the distances are, once again, as usual in the Soviet Union, the distances are insane.
Yeah, and by the way, Western European countries aren't used to these distances, so it's
correct.
It's not out of conceivability that German generals just, to them, they look at a map and think, oh, we can do this, but on the ground, it's impossible.
Right. You know, and in terms of geography, yeah, you've got a couple of river obstacles, the Don River in particular, but basically it's the steppe. It's wide open. It's like the Great Plains. It's flat and wide open, but it's essentially a wasteland. There are lots of farms, but there are very few good roads. There are very few good railroads. And by the way, in case people forget this, with the Germans' advance, they can't easily move up stuff by rail because the rail has to be converted. German trains and Soviet trains have a different railroad gauge. This was always a problem for the Germans. As they advanced deep into the Soviet Union, they have to physically change the width of the track, which, as you can imagine, hundreds and hundreds of miles, that's a major engineering undertaking.
Yeah. Almost be easier to change the width of the wheels on the trains themselves.
Yeah, exactly. So it's always a big problem. So in other words, as you pursue these geographically distant goals, you're going to run into supply problems.
Yep. Right.
You're going to run into logistical problems, 100% predictably. And also, I heard this on another podcast recently. I thought it was a really good point. Even if you manage to seize these oil reserves intact, there's really no good way to get them back to Germany efficiently because of these same issues, right? The transportation network is not geared toward bringing stuff from the Caucasus to Germany. And so that would have been an additional logistical problem, even if you change your goals.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, Adolf Hitler, before this campaign, said, and I quote, "If I do not get the oil of Maikop and Grozny, then I must finish this war."
Now, by finish this war, does that mean he has to just retreat from Russia or finish the war in total?
It's a good question. I suspect it's vague. I suspect that he's being euphemistic. I mean, you can easily read that as saying, like, if we don't do this, we're going to lose. But of course, he could never bring himself to say that.
Right.
But yeah, I must finish this war. What does that mean? You were going to finish the war by seizing these things. If you don't seize them, right? I mean, yeah, the logical questions follow.
Well, okay, then the next step in this whole chronology is, how does the offensive go?
In a way, it's kind of like in the broadest sense, like Operation Barbarossa itself the previous year, which is to say, at first it goes very, very well.
Yeah.
And it seems like the Soviets are done. So it starts off in the north of the Army Group South, the Germans' Army Group South operations area. So this is still southern Soviet Union, but it's farther north on the Don. The city of Voronezh falls very quickly, and then much of the Don Bend is cleared, and the panzers are rolling, often facing very little opposition. The Wehrmacht, to outsiders certainly, again seems to carry all before it. But there's some bad signs for the Germans, even though it seems to be going well at first. Lasting success, as in 1941, was predicated on massive battles of encirclement that capture and destroy massive Soviet forces.
Right.
That's what happened in the first stages of Barbarossa in the summer and fall of 1941. Right, the Germans took literally millions of prisoners. Here, it's a very different picture. Stalin is learning slowly how to become a better strategist, a better manager of military affairs. Unlike in 1941, in this case, he authorizes tactical retreats to avoid encirclement. Soviet forces learn to pull back so that they're not bagged by German armored pincer movements. And basically what the Soviets do is what, in a strategic sense, they should be doing whenever they're invaded, which is you trade space for time. You happily yield this meaningless real estate to the Germans as they extend their lines and extend their supply lines, and you fall back on your supply lines, and you keep your forces intact. Now, retreating for weeks and months, that can be demoralizing.
Yeah.
But you keep your army intact. And the Germans, in this early phase, they only have 2 pockets that they successfully trap. And they take something like 90,000 prisoners, which is a lot. It's nothing compared to what they intended to cap. They wanted to make it so their offensive would be won early because there would be no Soviet forces opposing them because they'd all be in the bag.
Yeah.
And predictably, 100% predictably, the Germans pretty quickly run into supply problems. The offensives, and we'll talk more about the different offensives soon, but the offensives very quickly run into supply problems. Several times the offensives, they have nothing in front of them. There's no opposition. They could just keep continuing basically like they were on maneuvers headed for their objectives, but they have to stop because they're running out of fuel, ammunition, and food. Those things take time to get you. Keep in mind that the German army is, I always harp on this, the German army is overwhelmingly still horse-drawn in World War II.
Yeah, that's always an irony because, that there's the standard joke that's a myth that the Germans invade Poland and the Polish cavalry on horses tries to stop tanks. And in reality, the German army is relying on horses much later in the war.
And it's partly the success of German propaganda, right?
Yeah.
The tanks, the armored formations, the trucks, the half-tracks, all those things get the attention. Overwhelmingly, this is a foot slog of an army.
That's
right?
amazing.
All their field kitchens, their hospitals, their artillery, it's all, with a few exceptions, it's all horse-drawn. So it's slow, right? The supplies, if they're horse-drawn, they can't keep up with the tanks and the trucks. Mm-hmm. And then compounded by the fact that you don't have roads and you're talking about huge distances, right? And when you have huge distances, we talked about this in another show, your trucks themselves, the supply trucks, they consume a lot of gasoline. So very quickly, supply problems, even when the offensive's going well, the supply problems multiply. Now, the initial plan was sequential, which is to say, one big offensive. First, you take Voronezh, you head down to the Don Bend, you cross to the Volga, you secure your flank on the Volga, and then you advance south into the Caucasus. That was the original plan. But Hitler, impatient, encouraged by the quick and early successes, changes this plan to simultaneous thrusts. Once again, sometimes he can't get out of his own way. So Army Group South, which was one of the 3 German army groups, right? An army group consists of multiple armies, just like it sounds. Army Group South was split into 2 army groups. Army Group A would head due south into the Caucasus, and at the same time, Army Group B would head due east towards Stalingrad. I would call this bad strategy 101.
Bad strategy 101.
Bad strategy 101.
A class basically that Hitler clearly skipped.
Exactly. Actually, that's the one class he passed, right? Bad strategy. So 2 simultaneous thrusts that geographically diverge. In other words, they're not in opposite directions, but they're diverging. They're pulling apart from each other. That means they are increasingly incapable of supporting each other, right? The farther apart they get because they're going in different directions, they can't quickly move around to support each other. And by the way, also now you've got 2 tenuous supply lines, or tenuous supply lines heading in 2 different directions rather than just one. So if anything, your supply situation is going to get worse. What you may be sensing here already is that a major part of this story is that Hitler and Stalin are at this very point following different trajectories as war leaders.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I really can't emphasize, so at the level of strategy and command, I can't emphasize this enough. Stalin is in the midst of a transformation. He had been a pretty bad military leader into early 1942. In fact, as late as May 1942, on the Southern Front, he was still interfering in military affairs and was largely responsible for the disaster right before Operation Blue at Kharkov in May. So that's actually, I think it's called the Battle of Kharkov. People look it up. It was a big Soviet offensive. They penetrated deep in the German lines, and they didn't take care of their flanks. The Germans counterattacked at the base of the salient, and the Soviets lost about 250,000 men.
Yikes.
Big disaster.
Yeah.
By September, so in the middle of this campaign, Stalin is learning to hold back and to delegate. He's identified some really good commanders like Georgy Zhukov. Very reluctantly, he learns to, once again, this is good management 101. Hire good people and let them do their jobs.
Right, exactly.
And he's learning how to do that. Hitler, at the same time, is doing the opposite. People will recall, I think it was in our Hitler and World War II episode way back in the day. Outside of Moscow in 1941, he felt like he had been proven right at the expense of his generals. The generals said, fall back from Moscow or we're done. He said, no, hold tight. The Wehrmacht miraculously survived. Hitler basically said to himself, I know better than my generals. And I just proved it. So if you're wondering why he thinks, he's the master strategist, that's one of the reasons. So while Stalin at this point is learning to meddle less, Hitler meddles more and more. He's very quick to replace generals, sometimes at the drop of a hat. Not always a good decision. For example, I'll just give you one example. In the middle of this campaign, he replaces Franz Halder. So this is late September 1942, replaces Franz Halder, who was chief of the Army General Staff. A pretty good general. I think we mentioned him in another show. He actually helped the U.S. write the history of World War II.
Yeah, that's right.
Which gave it a sort of a pro-German spin, right? It has to do with the clean Wehrmacht myth. Anyway, he's replaced by the less competent but far more pliable Kurt Zeitzler as Army Chief of Staff.
All right.
More importantly, Hitler's interference, in this campaign, he's repeatedly changing his plans. For example, the 4th Panzer Army, one of the 2 Panzer armies involved in this operation, he redirects it twice. And so it spends a lot of time zigzagging back and forth between these 2 divergent thrusts, and at one point actually getting involved in a massive traffic jam on the Don River with the other Panzer Group. A traffic jam that basically costs the Germans about a week.
Oh.
And this is all because Hitler keeps changing his mind, keeps changing the plans on the fly, and because, of course, he knows better than everyone else.
All right, then let's take these thrusts in turn. How does the advance, I'm looking at the map now, how does the advance south into the Caucasus go?
Again, very good progress at first. Takes a little while to take Rostov-on-Don, which is the big city that's on the Don, very close, that's farthest south point, right, closest to the Sea of Azov. It's taken in late July. The Don River is successfully crossed, and then there's a very rapid drive south. Soviet forces sort of melt away. They retreat. The Germans, the 1st Panzer Army, basically advances 300 miles in 2 weeks, which is amazing. That's super, super fast.
Right.
First of the oil-producing objectives, Maikop, so toward the west, in the Caucasus foothills closest to the Black Sea. Maikop is seized by the Germans on August 9th, which is relatively early, but only after the Soviets had completely wrecked the facilities. They blew up the oil derricks. They set everything on fire. I've seen an estimate that it would have taken a year to bring these oil facilities back online, and by the way, entirely foreseeable.
Wow.
If you want to seize the enemy's oil fields, they're probably going to try to deny them to you, even if they're pushed back beyond them, right? So they're going to go scorched earth. They're going to blow everything up, and that's exactly what the Soviets do. So as the German tanks roll in, everything's on fire. And it's like, congratulations, you seized these oil fields. Like, nice job.
That's what was going to happen, duh.
Yeah, entirely predictable. I mean, unless you were have a parachute drop, that seizes the oil fields before the Soviets can wreck them, but that's not going to happen in any case. Then as Axis forces reach the Caucasus foothills, the offensive stalls. The Soviet defense toughens. The terrain becomes a little more favorable to the defender because now we're getting into hilly territory. The German supply problems have become a nightmare. Long delays. Here's a little anecdote for you. The supply problems for Army Group A become so severe, there's a point where they're bringing up gasoline by camel.
Oh, Lord.
Which you do have camels in this part of the world.
Yeah. Well, that's right. We always forget that.
They weren't brought in from German zoos.
Yeah.
But still, if gasoline is heavy.
Yeah.
An individual camel can't carry that much gasoline compared to a truck. And by the way, both thrusts are also relying on air transport planes to bring supplies forward. which is another indication how you basically don't have sufficient supplies, sufficient logistics for your advances if you're relying on airplanes. In any case, by this point, the front has become much, much longer, and I mean hundreds of miles longer. And so German forces necessarily are spread thinner and thinner and thinner and have reduced combat power at the point of attack. Grozny never fell to the Germans, right? That second oil target was not taken. In early September, Hitler, in his frustration, he sacks the commander of Army Group A, Wilhelm List. And here's the kicker. Hitler takes command of Army Group A himself.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
I mean, maybe not a perfect analogy, but if you can imagine the United States at war and the president says, you know what, I'm going to fire one of my Joint Chiefs of Staff and I'm going to take his place. I mean, it's micromanagement doesn't really, that word doesn't really capture what's going on here. This is something much, much more extreme, right? He's the warlord. He's in charge of the entire German war effort, and now he's also adding to his portfolio the actual command, the command of an army group, which, by the way, he hangs on to until late November, until after this entire campaign goes south, when he finally puts someone else in charge. In any case, a little side note, at this point in the campaign, German mountain troops go on a little detour and scale Mount Elbrus, Elbrus, which is I believe it's the tallest mountain in all of Europe. Certainly the tallest mountain in the Caucasus. It's 18,000 feet high. Wow. These mountain troops go out of their way to scale it just so they can plant the swastika flag on the tippy top.
Yeah.
Purely symbolic. Hitler himself, when he finds out about this, he flies into a rage because he thinks it's just a stunt, which of course it is.
Sure.
But I thought that was kind of amusing. But by the time you get to October, early November, Army Group A's offensive in the south has fizzled. It's basically hit the wall and is stalled.
Well, Buzzkillers, I teach this, and I don't teach it anywhere near to the sophistication that Professor Nash is talking about. And one of the great things about the way he works with these shows is in this case especially, he sent me a series of maps, and it shows it's so much easier to understand all these things by looking at the map. So that sort of helps lead to the next question as I'm looking at the maps. How does the advance east towards Stalingrad itself go?
In a way, it's similar. It goes pretty well at first, right? The Germans clear most of the Don Bend pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And by the time you get to mid to late August, they're not. The Soviets have been caught flat-footed by Blue, and they're still transferring a lot of forces from elsewhere in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And so the German armored pincers or German armored formations head east towards Stalingrad pretty quickly. The spearhead is the 6th Army under the command of General Friedrich von Paulus. People may have heard of him. He's pretty famous. He's going to be responsible for the Stalingrad battle. He's not the right person in the right place at the right times from the German standpoint. He's basically, in a way, you want to say he's the Peter Principle.
Well, no, wait a minute now. We have to remind people what that is because actually...
Yeah, and by the way, you can also say it counts for Adolf Hitler himself.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about this the other day, but the Peter Principle is actually a really old book now, and the phrase Peter Principle has sort of got out of use, but it's important for this example, so to explain it.
Yeah, in a nutshell, the Peter Principle is you rise to the level of your incompetence. In other words,
the lowest level
whether
of
it's
your
whether it's in politics or in business or in military affairs, you basically keep rising, and at a certain point, you get to a level where you're not capable of what's required of you at that next level. Right, that's your level of incompetence. So, for example, if you say Hitler's a brilliant politician, his level of incompetence is as a military strategist. Right, he tries at the next level, and often because you've done so well at the previous levels, you think, I can do that. Yeah, and then you find out the hard way that. So in case of Friedrich von Paulus, he's a brilliant staff officer. He's had lots of experience as sort of a chief of staff, as doing plans. He helped plan Operation Barbarossa, by the way. Oh. He has virtually no experience as a field commander.
Yeah.
And yet he's put in command of not just the 6th Army. I should point out the 6th Army is essentially supersized. It is much, much larger than other German armies. It's a very powerful force. And its commander has very little field experience. And that's not going to help the Germans when their chips are down either. In any case, the thrust toward the east goes pretty well.
Yeah.
There's an armored spearhead that is making great progress north of the city. This is 16th Panzer Division. It in mid to late August, I believe on August 23rd, it runs into an Soviet anti-aircraft battery on the outskirts of the city, sort of on its northwest tip of the city. It's an anti-aircraft battery, which, basically it's a battery that they've got light anti-aircraft guns, and they depress the barrels so they can engage ground targets. and they basically duke it out with this German army formation. The fight lasts hours. The Soviet unit is completely wiped out, and the victorious Germans come up on their defeated enemy, and they're horrified to find out they've been fighting against women.
Yeah, now this is an amazing aspect of this and so many other parts of the, well, for lack of a better term, Eastern Front.
Yeah,
the war in the Soviet Union, the participation of women, frontline participation.
Yes, we've talked about in other shows, the Soviets make far more combat use of women than any other combatant nation. Their combat pilots, their tank crew, their anti-aircraft crew, in this case, they fight to the death.
Yeah.
You know, it's almost like a suicidal effort. And the Germans are sort of blown away by this. It's like we've just been fighting for hours against this unit that consists entirely of women. In any case, that same day, August 23rd, 16th Panzer Division reaches the Volga River north of the city.
Yeah.
And it's, the German participants, they're sort of amazed by their achievement. And they enter the suburbs. And here's where basically, so late August, here's where the battle for the city begins. That same day, August 23rd, the Luftwaffe launches what I believe is pretty sure this is the heaviest German bombing raid of the entire Russian campaign.
Yeah, okay.
Of the entire war in the East. The Luftwaffe, they fly hundreds and hundreds of sorties. They just bomb the city indiscriminately, right? It's basically terror bombing. They drop about 1,000 tons of bombs.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, just for perspective, the Hiroshima bomb is basically the equivalent of 13,000 tons of bombs. So what, it's like 1/13 of a Hiroshima bomb, just using conventional explosives. Thousands of civilians are killed. Tons and tons of rubble are created. And this is, in a way, I think it's emblematic of the campaign. So the Germans, we'll show them. We'll flatten this city. Well, actually what they do is they just create huge amounts of rubble that make the city much easier to defend.
Yeah, they can't get in, and the
they can't get in. You can't move around as easily.
Yeah, right.
Basically, defending rubble is easier than defending an intact city. You see this at Monte Cassino in Italy.
Yeah.
Right, in the spring of 1944. You see it elsewhere in World War II. You think you may be bombing the living crap out of the enemy, but you may actually be making things easier for the enemy. As good as bombing might make you feel.
Yeah.
And there are all sorts of Germans on the ground who whooping and hollering when they see the Luftwaffe arrive, because at this stage of the campaign, the Germans have complete control of the air.
Yeah.
By the way, it's one of the reasons why things go well early for them in this campaign, is they have complete control of the air. People may wonder if I mentioned why were there thousands of dead civilians? Wasn't the city evacuated? And the answer is no.
Yes.
This is not the only case of this.
Yeah.
Stalin deliberately refused to evacuate the city.
Mm-hmm.
And his thinking is that the Red Army forces on the ground will fight harder if they know they're fighting to save civilians.
Civilians who are right behind them.
Yes, exactly. And that's basically Stalin's military mindset in a nutshell. Just utter callousness that he treats, compared to other leaders like Churchill or Roosevelt, he treats his people, he treats the Soviet military as expendable resources. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. And so from here on out, many citizens of Stalingrad, men, women, children, old people, they're going to sweat out months of combat, basically living in their basements, living in holes in the ground, scrounging for food, and a lot of them dying, and partly because of the callousness of their own leader.
Well, now, lots of people see on the History Channel and history documentaries a lot of things about the Eastern Front and Battle of Moscow, and it looks like street-to-street fighting and people hiding behind buildings and stuff like that, these documentaries. But what was the battle for this city, that is this city, Stalingrad, actually like?
I obviously can't spend too much time on it, but so this is a battle that lasts, well, before the Soviet counteroffensive, spoiler alert, basically from September to November.
Yeah.
And some of it's going to end up being in the depths of Russian winter, so imagine what that means, even if you've got proper clothing, as the Soviets do. So it's unbelievably brutal. It's house-to-house combat for months. You might have days or weeks of struggle for a single block or building.
Yeah.
There are cases in this battle where you've got a big multi-story building, and the Soviets control the top of the building, and the Germans control the ground floors of the building, and they basically battle it out in the stairwells.
Yeah, yeah.
And you can imagine what that must be like.
Yeah.
Like, how do you advance up in a building when the enemy holds the higher part of it? It's just incredible to comprehend what's going on here. The Soviet army defending Stalingrad is the 62nd Army. It's headed by a general by the name of Vasily Chuikov, who is a very, very tough and very, very smart commander. Unlike Paulus, the Soviets do have the right guy in the right place at the right time. He's very, very smart. Basically, what the Soviets do is they feed in just enough troops to preserve a toehold in the city. And toward the end of the first phase, in other words, as the Germans are basically taking the city bit by bit, there are points where, remember, this is all on the west bank of the Volga, there are points where the Soviet toehold in Stalingrad is a couple of 100 yards deep. So, in other words, you might just have in one pocket, you might have a few buildings, maybe a block, half a block. The Germans are in front of you and the river's behind you. A couple 100 yards, which is nothing in military terms.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But he feeds in enough troops, and it is a meat grinder. The Soviets, as we'll see, suffer horrendous casualties. He feeds in just enough troops to hold on to the city and to keep them fighting, which, as we'll see, is going to allow the Soviets a lot of flexibility with the other manpower. In other words, they're not doing what the Germans are doing, which is sending in more and more and more troops in an effort to win. The Soviets send in just enough troops to avoid losing. They also engage in a tactic. This is not the first time this happens, certainly not the last. The Viet Cong in Vietnam was very good at this. They do what's called clinging to the enemy's belts.
Yeah, that's right. I've read about this, but I don't really know what it means.
Yeah, it's super important. It's sort of military affairs 101. But basically, when you're in combat, you can choose how to position your front line in relationship to the enemy. Mm-hmm. And in an urban environment that is largely rubble, it's relatively easy to maintain your front line very, very close to the enemy.
Oh, right. Okay.
Sometimes as little as 50 yards or 100 yards. In other words, no man's land might be essentially non-existent. And the reason you do this is you make it very, very difficult for the Germans to use their heavy firepower, to use their air assets, to use their heavy artillery and mortars, because the stuff is not that accurate and they would risk hitting their own men, right? Your casualties from friendly fire would go through the roof. And so if you can keep your line, if you can hug the Germans basically, or hang on to their belts as it's called, that nullifies a lot of the German advantage in firepower. And that's exactly what happens in Stalingrad. And the Germans find it very, very frustrating, right? Normally they would just pummel the crap out of the enemy in order to advance, right? Sure. Soften up the defensive line. But you can't do that if you risk harming your own troops. So this is also, as you might imagine, this urban environment is an ideal situation for snipers, which the Soviets take, I think, fuller advantage of. In fact, the Soviets create what has been called sort of a cult of the sniper. It becomes a big propaganda effort. They identify several marksmen who are very, very good at this. They become even better. Several individual Soviet soldiers each have over 100 kills, which is a lot in the sniper world. Mm-hmm. They become very skilled, especially at killing Germans who are bringing food up, right? Wow. In other words, a German who's just behind the front line, but he has to move around because he's got all these, the big soup tureen or whatever rations he's bringing up. He sort of stands out, and so you shoot him. Yeah. Some of these snipers are ingenious. I was reading about this. I'll just give you one example. So there's one sniper who was very successful. Off to his right, he would dig a fake trench along the front line, and in that fake trench, he would rig a surrender flag on sort of a pivot to a rope that then led back to his trench over to the left. Yeah. And so he would tug on the rope and it would wave this surrender flag back and forth above the edge of the trench. Mm-hmm. And according to the sniper, invariably when that flag is waving, someone on the German side will stick their head up over the parapet to have a look. Yeah. Because they're thinking, oh, look, these Soviets here want to surrender. We should look and see what's happening. And the minute that German raises his head above the parapet, he's killed by the sniper. Yeah, firing from another angle.
Yeah, it's amazing how often this works too, because you would think the word would spread among the German lines. Don't fall for this, but they do.
Yeah, and some of these really successful snipers, they become really, really adept. For example, at making sure there's a white background behind you, so your flash of your rifle isn't so obvious. Little things that you own, the sort of tricks of the trade that can make you a much more effective sniper. By the way, the really good snipers are sometimes pulled out of the line so they can train other snipers. Right, basically as a force multiplier. The most famous of these snipers is a fellow by the name of Vasily Zaitsev, who had, I think, in the whole of the war, not just in the battle, but the whole of the war, had 225 kills. Zaitsev is played by Jude Law in a 2001 motion picture called Enemy at the Gates, which maybe some listeners have watched. It's an okay movie. It gets some things right. Mm-hmm. Some of the atmospherics of the Battle of Stalingrad, it's pretty good on. For example, it does a good job depicting the terror of troops being fed into Stalingrad on the Soviet side by crossing the Volga as German dive bombers are swooping down on you. That was incredibly risky, and there were lots of casualties in that. Movie also shows this initial advance in which Zaitsev takes part, where the Soviet soldiers are ordered to advance even though there's only one rifle for every two soldiers.
Yeah, that's amazing, yeah. sort of assuming one of them is going to be killed anyway, and we'll just take the
exactly.
rifle.
And that right, the guy who loses the lottery or loses the coin toss and doesn't get the rifle, he's basically told, well, when someone else falls, you can grab his rifle. And I'm here to tell you, militarily, this is no way to run an airline.
Exactly.
I mean, it really isn't, but that did happen, and it happened not just in this battle. One thing the movie gets a little bit wrong is the NKVD, which is sort of the precursor to the KGB. They had large armed units out in the field as well. They did have what are called blocking units. In other words, they set up a second line behind the first Soviet line to basically encourage Soviet soldiers not to retreat, because this blocking force is behind you. Now, in the movie, they are gunned down like dogs when they retreat because their attack against the Germans isn't working. That's not how this went down. These blocking forces basically would detain, they would capture these retreating soldiers and then basically take them aside and put them on trial later, sometimes shoot them, sometimes just punish them. The only people they shot in combat were members of penal battalions who were falling back.
Okay.
Yeah, the Soviets, we could do a whole show on them. The penal battalions, basically, if you were being punished, they put you into penal battalion, and you would do things, for example, like in winter combat, you'd be sent out in black clothing to draw fire. So, obviously, if these people retreat, then sometimes they get shot on the spot by the NKVD. Anyway, so that was a little inaccurate. The big inaccuracy is basically the whole thrust of the movie, which is Zaitsev did not, as far as we know, have a one-on-one duel with the top German sniper in the ruins of Stalingrad.
Yeah, but it's a movie. They have to do that.
It is a movie. As a movie, it's not a bad movie.
It is a movie. It's pretty good.
There's no evidence that Jude Law went toe-to-toe with Ed Harris in the ruins of Stalingrad. In any case, on September 30th, Adolf Hitler publicly announced, "We will never leave Stalingrad."
Wow.
And remember, he's all about the power of will, right?
Yeah.
The will to power, et cetera, et cetera. It's almost like, well, if I announce it, it's got to become true.
Yeah.
Right? Because then we'll have to, we can't make a liar out of me. So he says we'll never leave Stalingrad. So already their frame of mind is not terribly positive for what's going to happen later. Let's put it that way. But by this point, it's almost like the Germans have become mesmerized with taking the city, partly because of symbolic value.
Yeah.
But I mean, in a way, it's almost like a fascination with process. Like once we start to try to take this city and we find out we can't, then we just double down and triple down. It's like, well, we got to take this city. And so they lose all sense of proportion. Taking the city was not strategically necessary. You already have your forces on the Volga. You've already blocked Volga river traffic. Your flank for Army Group A further south has already been secured. You don't need to take the whole city, and yet the Germans pour more and more resources into this cauldron, basically.
Yes, cauldron's a very good word for it because it is a bowl of death.
Yeah. No, there are Soviets who basically, they're basically being sent into Stalingrad across the Volga from the East Bank, and they look at the city, and it's basically there's this red glow and smoke everywhere and ruins, and it's like, I'm entering hell. Like, that's what this looks like. And let's take a step back for a second and also just take in the bigger picture, which is militarily, in terms of the operational art of warfare. What the Germans are doing in Stalingrad is basically voluntarily forfeiting their strong suit.
Oh, no, this is very, 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 very interesting. Forfeiting their strong suit. Okay.
They're right. They voluntarily start playing the enemy's game. Think about it. Think about the early campaigns against Poland and France and Yugoslavia and Greece or Rommel in North Africa. The German brilliance is mobile warfare. Right? Blitzkrieg. Combined arms, mobile units, deep penetrations in the enemy rear, taking advantage of wide open flat terrain, massive battles of encirclement. That's what the Germans are best at. In Stalingrad, you've thrown all that away and you're now bogged down in house-to-house, street-to-street fighting, which it turns out you're actually not that good at because you've never really done it. Not on this scale.
Yeah.
The Soviets turned out to be, partly because the Soviets are defending, right? That's a huge advantage, especially in urban warfare. The Soviets are better at it, and the Germans are learning how to do urban warfare on the fly, and they suffer massive casualties in doing that. So winter sets in early November. By this point, the Germans have, in fact, and Hitler crows about it publicly on November 8th, the Germans have taken about 80 or 90% of the city by that point, but at what cost? They've basically thrown the cream of the 6th Army into the meat grinder.
Yeah.
The Luftwaffe, even though you have control of the air, they've suffered horrible losses by this point. Right? The German air forces are still superior, but they're basically at half strength by this point. They've lost a lot of bombers and fighters.
That's amazing.
Right? The operational aircraft, has gone way, way down. In fact, A lot of this air power has been basically sopped up in fighting in Stalingrad when it could have been supporting the advance into the Caucasus.
Which is where the oil is.
That was the main purpose of your campaign. That's what I mean. Sort of this mesmerization of Stalingrad. It's like, why are you diverting all your air forces to this secondary battle? It makes no sense. More decisively, more important long term, is that because the Sixth Army sends more and more of its troops into the fight in Stalingrad itself, it leads the defense of its flanks. So to the south of Stalingrad, and then along the Don heading to the northwest of Stalingrad, the flanks are left to the Allied forces, in particular the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies, but also the Hungarians and the Italians. And by the way, in terms of German forces, only a minimal reserve force is kept back out of Stalingrad. In other words, what the Germans have done, without knowing it, is they've created a terrific opportunity for the Soviets to take advantage of.
Well, this is the perfect cliffhanger to leave us salivating for part two. And as you've been talking, I've been wondering at what point does that famous Soviet General Winter come in to the picture? And so you have two things going on here, two cliffhangers. Winter is set in, and now this opportunity for the Soviets.
Absolutely.
Well, there you have it, Buzzkillers. Stalingrad Part 1, setting up the context, showing very clearly how Hitler is just, by taking command and by making mistake after mistake after mistake and doubling down, tripling down, has caused a real problem. So thank you, Professor Nash, for putting us in this situation, putting us in this spot where we then now, as I said, are salivating to find out what happens.
Leaving you hanging on the cliff.
Yeah, what happens in Part 2.
We'll get to it then.
So Buzzkillers, please tune in next week and you'll find out exactly what happens. Go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com. Do everything you need to do there. I'll see you at the Yacht Club to talk more about Stalingrad next week.